All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. A big shout out and thank you to the donors of the Northeast Harbor Library who make a lot of this possible. My name is Peter Rogers. I'm a member of the board of directors, and it's my pleasure to introduce Karin today. Having read her book and really enjoyed it, I'm looking forward to hearing her speak. First, I'd like to say a little bit about the library. So we're proud to bring you these programs, and we have lots of other offerings as well. And we're proud to do so free of charge. Lots of libraries do that, but I'll say that we're a little bit different, because what sets us apart is that most public libraries receive, on average, about 80% of their funding from local government resources. We don't. Ours is much less. In fact, well over half our operating budget comes through the generosity of our patrons and our donors. That really sets us apart. So we encourage all of the users of our services to think of us when they are allocating their charitable resources. And now on to Karin. So her impressive resume includes her role as the past president and CEO of the Forest Society of Maine, as well as other important positions. In Loving the North Woods, she recounts, often from personal experience, the difficult challenges faced and the successes achieved during the pivotal period of 25 years from 1990 to 2015. And during that time, huge tracts of land of Maine's North Woods were sold, primarily by the paper companies who had owned them for as many as 100 years. So let's define huge. Here's a little quiz question for you. Who can tell me what the acreage of the state of Connecticut is? Wild guess.
15 million acres.
It's 3.5 million acres. That's a lot of acres. The North Woods of Maine consist of 12 million acres, more than 3 times the acreage of the entire state of Connecticut. And in that 12 million acres, there are all of 10,000 residents. Yeah, quite remarkable. So when these sales happened, there was fear, there was uncertainty with pristine lake shores and river banks all of a sudden be sold off and developed. Beautiful old growth forests, majestic highlands, the unfair access to this land, which is a tradition in Maine, be curtailed. Happily, the answer was no. Heroes appeared both from national organizations and from local grassroots efforts. Laws were changed. The conservation easement was put into use to an extent that no one thought possible. Karin, I'm sure we'll talk about that. There was big money, very big money. And the goal was to strike the delicate balance between conservation protection, economic sustainability, and that wonderful unfettered access to Maine's resources by Maine's residents. Maine went from about 5% of its land being protected to about 20% in that period of time. Remarkable progress. Ever been up to the West Branch of the Penobscot? How about Moosehead Lake? Like them? Yeah. Thank Karin. Are you happy to know that the 100-mile wilderness will remain forever wild? Thank Karin.
Not just me, please. Lots of people.
Karin didn't just love the North Woods. She studied them, she explored them, she understood them, she appreciated them, and ultimately she had a major role in helping to save them. So we should all be grateful, not just for the stories that she's telling, but also for the work that she did. So, well.
Thank you so much, and thank the library for this wonderful venue, and I want to thank all of you for being here. This is a beautiful sunny day in a beautiful place, and to give some of your time to hear some stories, I'm so appreciative. So thank you. I'm going to stand here because I think there may be some people Zooming, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, and so if you can't hear me for any reason, just do something, raise your hand or something, speak up. And I will talk for a bit. Please ask burning questions while I'm talking. And I've found that question and answer for these has really been very enjoyable and helpful for all of us, including me. So I welcome your questions. My name again is Karin Tilberg. And I wrote this book because there are these stories that took place of great conservation in a great place that really hadn't been told or hadn't been announced in a comprehensive way. And I'm not an author, I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic, but I wanted to tell these stories, and a lot of people helped me with that, and I thank them. And I hope that it gives the flavor of this time of historic conservation in Maine. As Peter mentioned, here's a map of Maine. Maine is about 20 million acres. The green is what is known generally as the North Woods, 12 million acres. This is Connecticut, and if you squish it around, 3.5 times Connecticut can fit in the North Woods. Most of the North Woods has no organized towns. It's mostly unorganized territory that do not have municipal governments. And as Peter mentioned, maybe 10,000 people live in that unorganized territory. This area is very famous as for many reasons. And I think the hardest part is just to convey early on in this talk how significant this place is. Here you see a map of what has been designated as a global important bird area by the National Audubon. We have here one of the most important globally significant bird areas in the world. And this has really been designated by Dr. John Hagan as sort of a bird refuge or sanctuary, because there's enough woodland habitat, forest habitat, to where bird populations in this area are actually increasing, where they are decreasing in other parts of the country and the world. Right here in Maine, in our North Woods, a global important bird area. It's also one of the darkest skies, probably the darkest sky east of the Mississippi River. It is the iconic home for very healthy populations of iconic wildlife. We have wild brook trout in Maine, legacy brook trout, a very sustaining population of them, the healthiest population east of the Mississippi. We have pine marten, moose, lynx, all those songbirds. And it's really the least fragmented, undeveloped, intact forest east of the Mississippi. We have big rivers that drain, as someone mentioned earlier, the Allagash, the west branch of the Penobscot. We have the St. John. We have the Kennebec, the Androscoggin, the St. Croix. And this area is hugely important for carbon sequestration. 91% of Maine's annual greenhouse gases are sequestered annually by Maine's forests. And that's all of our forests, but a big chunk of it is our North Woods. 91% of our greenhouse gases are sequestered and captured by our forests in Maine. We've got to hold on to them. And I think for me, this quotation captures the uniqueness of the situation here. This is the largest, most intact, contiguous, temperate forest in North America, and perhaps globally, that has remained continuously forested since pre-settlement times. Right here in Maine, this is our Northwoods. And I want to say also a moment of recognition that this is the home for the ancestors of the Wabanaki that have lived here for 12,000 years. And this is their travel route, this is their home, this is their place where they are part of it. And, you know, they have these 12,000 years of longevity here as the glaciers retreated, and the woods are still here. So why did I write this book? I'll just read a little bit of my book here and there, just a little bit. Maybe this gives a sense of why I wrote it. When I am in the Northwoods, it is true to some deep part of me, and I feel a visceral connection to its forests, mountains, and rivers. To experience a sense of being home is something that is not to be taken for granted. I am certainly not alone in loving the Northwoods. Its power, mystique, and undeveloped bigness enrich the soul for many individuals. I write this story because it is the account of historic conservation measures that unfolded in a place that many call home. A multitude of people wish for the Northwoods to continue in its greatness far into the future. It is a place that I love. This is a love story. And that's why I wrote the book. So the book, as Peter mentioned, focuses on a tremendously significant time from 1990 to 2015. And during this period, and really it's mostly 1990 to 2005 or 10, where the unimaginable happens. The starting point really is a run-up, is the mid to late 1980s. At that time in that great Northwoods, about 12 landowners owned about 10 million acres of that 12 million acres. And these were largely paper companies and a few large family ownerships. And some of you probably have heard of them: International Paper, Great Northern Paper, Georgia Pacific, Scott Paper, Seven Islands Pingree, Champion Paper, Fraser, and a handful of others. That group owned pretty much the Northwoods and managed it for paper products to feed the mills and for other wood products as well. And then suddenly, you know, kind of bear with me here, in less than a decade, from 1990 to 1999, 9.1 million acres of forest lands changed hands in that great Northwoods. That took place in 34 transactions. That's almost half of Maine. And so I'll just read again a brief excerpt of kind of what was going on there during that time. And a colleague of mine, Kathy Johnson, who worked at Natural Resources Council of Maine at the time, and I started compiling this. On June 3rd, 1998, Sappi Fine Paper North America announced that it placed all of its Maine timber holdings of 911,000 acres on the market. On October 19, 1998, South Carolina-based Bowater, formerly GNP, Great Northern Paper, announced that it would explore selling a substantial amount of its 2 million acres of Maine forest lands and mills as a package. On October 21, 1998, Bowater announced that it was selling 911 acres of timberland and a sawmill to J.D. Irving. On November 2nd, 1998, Bowater announced that it was selling 656,000 acres of Maine forest land to McDonald Investment Company of Birmingham, Alabama. On December 5th, 1998, International Paper sold 185,000 acres of Maine forest land. In February of 1999, International Paper announced its intention to sell another 245,000 acres in northern Maine. And on April 26, 1999, Georgia Pacific announced that it was selling 446,000 acres of forest land in Washington County. And it goes on. So I list some of these major sales to get a sense of this rapid fire announcement of sales of huge tracts of forest land in Maine. No one saw it coming. No one like could have predicted it. Some of the forest economists like Lloyd Erlin said, you know, he didn't see it coming. No one could grasp what the significance and outcome of all of this would be. Yes.
Can I ask, is that because the paper companies were seeing economic downsides and wanted to get out?
Yes, why don't I just explain a little bit about why all this happened. So there were 3 or 4 major forces at work here. One was this slow but steady decrease in paper consumption. That was a factor. It was starting to be a factor even at that time. There was a growing international competition for paper. Mills in China and other parts of the world had large, efficient paper mills. And so the investment in Maine mills and some other mills in the country, the investment was slowing. And so the paper mills were not as competitive. And then there was a major tax change that made the gains on capital gains less profitable for S corporations. So the paper companies that were organized a certain way were not able to benefit as much, and their owners and shareholders were not able to benefit as much. And so the tax changes, the decrease in paper demand, and growing competition all sort of collapsed onto this ownership pattern of the paper mills and the forest land, and often hydro. And I do want to just say one more word about that mixture of mills, land, hydro. So most of the paper companies that I listed not only had mills that they were feeding, and with the forest land, they would harvest from their forest land, sometimes buy on the market, but they also, some of them had hydro facilities. And so as we entered this period of time, the mills started selling their land. They felt that they could buy the wood they needed from the market. They didn't need the forest land. It was a non-performing asset, as the term was used. It was a drag, and that also the tax benefits weren't as available. So their feeling was, the accountants and the markets was, let's sell the forest land, get the money, and we can figure this out by buying wood on the market. Some of the sales did involve wood supply agreements. So when they sold the land, the buyer promised to supply wood for a period of time. So this was really remarkable. And this was happening not only in Maine, but across the northern forest. The northern forest is Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, and probably other places in the northern tier of the US. But these 4 states were feeling this deluge of sales hard. They were feeling it very strongly, and it was affecting workers in the wood products sector. It was affecting communities that depended on these forest lands for access to hunt and fish or for outdoor recreation. It was central to Maine's economy, the paper industry, and this was true as well for the other states. So it was a very profoundly unsettling time. And the fear and uncertainty, Peter, that you mentioned, was palpable. people did not know who was going to buy it. What were their intentions? Were they going to develop all the lakefront lots? Were they going to post and have no trespassing? Were they going to continue to manage for forestry? You know, there were huge questions. And the buyers for much of this land included timber investment management organizations. And so oftentimes, TIMO is an acronym for that. A group of investors would be pooled into a group, I know the name, and they would buy forest land, and the forest land would be managed, and the revenue from that would go to the investors. And so that's what a TIMO is. One of the major buyers was a REIT, a real estate investment trust, and that was Plum Creek Timber Company that owned land out west. And that also has a different structure than the S Corporation or the TIMO, but it enabled the REIT to be able to do some real estate sales as part of their income generation. And that was unsettling to people. And all of this, you know, the legislatures were involved, our US Congress certainly were right on top of it, trying to understand what this meant. And so the 4 states started to work together, the governors of the 4 states. And the governors of the 4 states, along with the US Forest Service, first commissioned a northern forest land study. And that's, again, those 4 states. And the study took about 2 years, and it looked at what are those forces that led to these sales, and what are some of the implications from the sales, and you know, what should be done. And there were some efforts to look at solutions. At the end of those 2 years, though, there was still a lot of chaos and a lot of concern. And there were some people that wanted, you know, that were arguing, let's try to protect all this land and make, you know, have strong federal ownership. And then there were people that were very concerned about federal ownership, and were concerned that federal ownership would mean loss of local control, and that they would lose their connection and their traditions with the land. And so there was this tension that was across the region of, what should we do here? There were strong forces. I went to some hearings. I was involved working for a coalition called Northern Forest Alliance. And some of those meetings, you know, people were standing like in different groups, and you know, it was a tense period of time. Yes.
Was that in before, say, I mean, 98, you were talking about all those sales, and so was it 2004? When did those 2 years of investigation before?
I think that was about 2000 to 2000, 1998 to 2000.
So they were right on.
It was very much on it, and I would want to double check that date, but it was around 1998 to 90 or 1999 to 2001. So US Congress was paying attention to all this. And after those 2 years, the decision was made by the governors and by the delegations of those 4 states. Let's have a more intensive process. And so a Northern Forest Lands Council was formed. Each governor got to appoint a number of people representing different interests, forest products, outdoor recreation, I think community and environmental. And that process was well-funded and well-staffed. And that process was very intensive and went another 4 years, I think. And I'm going to just read a little bit about that process and kind of where it came out. I'll say that Peter's high school and college friend, Roger Milliken, was on that council for Maine. A dear friend of mine, Jerry Bly, was on that council. Some wonderful people were on these councils, representing the 4 states. And they put so much time into this, listening and really having an open process, inviting input. There was vast input across the region. I've never seen such vibrant, genuine citizen involvement. So I'm going to just read a paragraph from the final report of the Northern Forest Lands Council. And it reads, "For its 1 million residents, this region is home. They have a connection to the land fewer and fewer Americans experience or understand. They have grown up hunting and fishing, trapping, and walking in the woods here. They are loggers, farmers, and business people. They work in the mills that have been the backbone of the region's economy for decades. Nearly 85% of the Northern Forest is privately owned and has provided a diversity of environmental and economic benefits. The economic vitality of these private land ownerships is integral to community strength and the overall economic health of the region. Some families have taken care of their forests and farms for generations. They have seen storms, droughts, great fires, and hard times. Living in the Northern Forest has often been difficult, but its people are proud of their endurance, their heritage, and a way of life so different than in the urban areas around them." And, that's the opening paragraph of the final report. And I would say probably most people would not love the report and the recommendations in this, that came out of it, but it somehow managed to hit a balance of conservation, economic strategies, ideas for community and business health. It somehow managed to hit the right balance that people were able to accept the solutions. And that is so wonderful. I can say I wasn't incredibly gleeful about it. I probably was pushing for a little more immediate conservation, but overall, it was so thoughtful and so genuine, and it has guided us and guided the region since that time. So I strongly recommend it if it's quite big, if you have a quiet time. So I wanted to say that during this time, there were a lot of visions. There were visions that I work primarily in Maine with communities. I work for the coalition called the Northern Forest Alliance. It was an alliance of conservation, environmental, economic, business, and outdoor recreation groups. And we were really committed to trying to work with the communities that surround the Northwoods. So gateway communities, we call them, areas like Bethel and Greenville and Grand Lake Stream and Jackman and up to Fort Kent and some towns in Presque Isle. We did a lot of meeting with people and hearing their concerns and hearing about their dreams. And we would work with them to try to have them put their ideas down on paper. And we helped them with mapping and data, but it was their dreams. And we encouraged them to send their visions to representatives, their local representatives and our Congress people. And the book will talk a little bit about how important that is, in my view, to some of the outcomes that took place. And these are just people that have never been involved in any kind of community, organizing or visioning around the, land use planning, but they had small businesses that depended on selling outdoor gear or a small local market that, where loggers would go in the morning or sometimes guides. And, they were concerned. And so we asked them, what do you want to hold on to? What is it that matters? And most of them really wanted to hold on to what was there. They just didn't want the change. They liked the North Woods the way it was. They wanted access. They wanted the fish and wildlife to remain healthy. They wanted wood products opportunities. They did not want development. And they wanted to see this place stay the way it was. And so put that in maps with those goals, and those were shared over time with the political leaders and, most importantly, the landowners. So what I talk about in the book is sort of how those visions and visions from and science about the key natural resources of the region, came to fruition. So just by way of contrast, the map here shows the conserved land in 1990, at that start of this period of time. And as Peter mentioned, about 5% of Maine had some form of conservation. And this is conservation, and as I define it, means some legal status that has permanency to it, that prevents harmful activities. And it could be government owned, could be a land trust ownership, could be a wildlife refuge or a state park or a national park, or public land. And so you can see we didn't have a lot. 5%. Maine was kind of at the low end of public land in the entire country at that time. So I'm going to give you a sense of what happened then. So after this period of time, everything in color had a form of conservation. So I'm going to quickly go through this, but just visually look at the amount of land that then, after this period of time, had some form of legal conservation status. And that's where we go from 5% of Maine being conserved to almost 20% with these different projects that brought about conservation.
Karin, can you flip to the first slide first?
Yes.
Just for 1 second. And then back. Thank you.
And I can go back and forth if you want, if you have questions. Zach, if I go over here, can people hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to just give a quick touch of these projects. One of these projects, and each project has its own personality, its own potential failure, and sort of the critical force of it that brought it across the finish line. And so each one is different. I'm going to start with the St. John River. This is the purple here. And this project really was led by the Nature Conservancy Maine chapter. And International Paper put about 185,000 acres on the market. It was in that list that I read. And TNC Maine chapter had been trying to acquire some of the key lands along the St. John River, which are extremely ecologically significant. Some of you may have heard about the furbished lousewort. That was, it's a very unusual plant that Kate Furbish identified in the 1800s. I'm not great with those, remembering the dates, but this was a rare plant, and it needs a lot of disturbance every year from the ice melting and the roughing out of the shoreline. And it does very well in the St. John. The St. John had been proposed to be dammed at one point, and there was great concern about damming this river, a wild river. And so TNC had been trying to protect the corridor. And so they partnered with an investor group who had reached out to them, and the investors said, if we make a bid on this, will you buy the shoreline for about 3 million acres? And so they said, yes, we will partner with you to do that. Their bid came in third, so they lost the bid. But then, about a week or so later, they found out the number one bidder, Leroy Martin, couldn't pull together the financing. So then the landowner, IP, went to the second bidder. And the second bidder had, in the meantime, gone to put its money somewhere else. So their bid came to the top. But then the partner they were going to go with had put their money somewhere else. So they had to decide whether they could raise, I think it was $35 or $38 million in 6 weeks. So the head of TNC Maine at the time, Kent Womack, called the head of TNC National and said, can we borrow $38 million or 35? Anyway, long and short, the board, and Roger was part of this, Roger Milligan, and others kind of held hands and jumped off a cliff virtually. And they committed to buying this land and raising the money to buy it, and they did. And so read about that in that chapter. It's right on the edge of your seats. I mean, it almost went through, and it just was a fate that those top two bidders went through. So that's the Upper St. John River, it ended up being, I think it was 185,000 acres at the time. They were able to trade and sell a little bit of unimportant land. So I think now they own about 135,000 acres. Some of it's ecological reserve with no harvesting, and some of it's managed. And much of it is under a carbon deal. So that's this purple. Let's try the next one I'll mention is the Pingree New England Forestry Foundation deal. Think about what 800,000 acres is. It's a lot, it's almost 1 million acres. So the Pingree deal is this tomato color here. I don't know if that's really the right color name, but it's this, all of that. And it's almost 800,000 acres. And the Pingree family is a family, multi-generation, has owned about 1 million acres in Maine and managed it for forest products. But the family was getting bigger. And many of you might know what happens sometimes. The family is making decisions as their new generations, trying to figure out whether to own it or sell it or how to manage it. It gets pretty complicated as families get bigger. And so the Pingree family was facing this kind of situation with, the family growing and new generations becoming of age and trying to figure out what to do. So they worked with New England Forestry Foundation to negotiate a conservation easement for 762,192 acres. And that easement is permanent. And I'll just say a word about conservation easements. You all may know about them, but just in case, the conservation easement is a legal permanent restriction that is negotiated between a landowner and either a land trust or a government that's permitted under statute to hold a conservation easement. And in that easement, certain rights are transferred by the landowner. The landowner's rights are transferred and held, if you will, by the land trust or the government. And these would be rights such as the right to develop a water slide park, or the right to build a water extraction plant, or the right to develop shoreline, or the right to mine for molybdenum. Shouldn't have picked that one, but because I can't say it. but these rights you might have as a landowner, you're transferring, so you no longer have them once the easement is finalized. And the easement is put in the registry of deeds. And so any buyer of that land forever knows that they will not be buying those rights because they're held by the land trust or the state or the government entity. So they permanently transferred development rights on almost 800,000 acres of land and severely limited some other of their rights and to ensure that there's sustainable forest management. And there's some assurances for permanent public access. So what they did basically was say, we're going to keep these forest land parcels the way they are now. And that was a breakthrough. It was a huge breakthrough. And again, looking at the recommendations from the Northern Forest Land Study, that helped set the stage for that kind of approach. So I'll quickly, I don't want to take too much time here, mention a few of these others.
So this easement, does this mean that in terms of people being able to enjoy it?
Yes, most of the easements that I'll be talking about or that have been done during this time allow people to have pedestrian access on the land. It doesn't give us the right to drive or use ATVs. Sometimes a few of them allow snowmobiles. But the tradition of pedestrian access is something that was really strongly spoken to during the Northern Forest Land Study. And that was something that people were very concerned about. So most of these projects now assure pedestrian public access for hiking, hunting, fishing, roaming. And it would be, the only reason you could post the land would be if you're doing active forest management or for safety issues. So that's something that all of these were trying to hold on to those traditions. I'll mention that there's a person here that did some volunteer work with AMC, the Appalachian Mountain Club, had been looking for expanding opportunities in the New England for people to hike. And they were looking in Maine, because Maine's big, and they wanted a big place. You know, the White Mountains have this amazing system that they operate and manage, but, you know, it gets crowded. And so they were looking in Maine, and they identified the 100-mile wilderness area that the Moosehead Lake is right in here. And this is part of the Appalachian Trail. This is the Appalachian Trail here. And it goes right through this area. And they were very interested in trying to acquire that land, to build a system of huts and hiking trails and skiing trails. But you know, they first looked in Western Maine, but they didn't find exactly the right place. And then International Paper announced they were going to be selling land here. And I was working for John Baldacci, who was governor at the time, who was very supportive of conservation. And they asked Governor Baldacci, would you put in a good word with International Paper to see if they might sell it to AMC? And so he called up his contact at International Paper and strongly encouraged them to consider selling to the Appalachian Mountain Club. And I'll just recount one quick story. There was a moment when Governor Baldacci and I came into the Hall of Flags in the Capitol in Augusta. It's a big hall with flags and a rotunda and this big staircase. The representative from International Paper came from one door, a representative from ANC came from another, and Governor Baldacci and I came from under the grand staircase. And we met at the bust of of Governor Baxter, who was right, that bust is right in the center. And that's when they shook hands on the deal. It was pretty sweet. So, and AMC's just done a tremendous job with that. And they've acquired now more land, and they're over 100,000 acres now that they own and manage. Much of that is ecological reserve, but they also manage sustainable forests, and they have carbon sales. And you can go from hut to hut and ski from hut to hut or hike from hut to hut, and there's mountain biking there too. So yeah, AMC, 100-mile wilderness. So I'll mention two more. I could use so much time. So some of you may have heard about Plum Creek. Plum Creek, a Seattle-based company, they had a plan that they submitted to Maine's Land Use Regulation Commission to develop, I think it was almost 2,000 developments around Moosehead Lake and 2 resorts. And it was a terribly fraught time. People from all over the state spoke to this, some in support, but many opposed. There was vandalism. The FBI came in. There was tension in the community because there were some people in support and many opposed. It was just a very difficult time. And you can read a little bit more about it in the book. I was not involved in the actual lake concept plan debate because I was working for Governor Balbacci, and that was a adjudicatory regulatory body decision, and we were trying to keep him. He was being lobbied heavily by everyone to take a position. He was like, no, the Land Use Regulation Commission makes this decision. But as part of that final decision that was approved, it was scaled back considerably. A 359,000 acre conservation easement was required. So, and some fee lands were also at the same time sold to the Nature Conservancy and to AMC. And some ecological reserves were created on the TNC properties. So this is the Moosehead Region Conservation Easement that's yellow. And again, that's about 360,000 acres permanently conserved, no development, assured public access. And I'll actually spill the beans. I was working as a president and CEO of Forest Society, and I got a call from a very wonderful person that worked for, well, Plum Creek sold their land to Weyerhaeuser, and Plum Creek went away. There is no Plum Creek anymore, it's gone. So Weyerhaeuser now owns the land under the yellow, and we hold, the Forest Society of Maine holds the easement, the yellow easement that came out of this regulatory proceeding. And I got a call from a wonderful man from Moosehead Lake area, Luke Muzzy, who said, Karen, I'd like to come meet with you. And I said, sure, come over. So he sat down and said, we are going to ask LERC to end the lake concept plan, make it go away. This is a concept plan that permitted 2,000 dwellings and 2 or 3 resorts. And Weyerhaeuser did not want to take it, they didn't want to use that. They didn't want the obligation of there were certain obligations associated with it over time. And they just wanted to manage the land for forestry. So there is no Plum Creek concept plan anymore. It's just forest land now, and the easement's permanent, and it's sort of like an amazing thing that happened. Yeah. I'm not saying, perhaps conveying the startledness that we all had when that happened, but it was very startling. The Down East Lake Land Trust project is this in brown. This is a combination of fee and easement. And the chapter on this project is called What Courage Looks Like. And to me, the courage of the group of small business owners, guides, in the small community of Grand Lake Stream, sitting around trying to think, what are we going to do? Because an investor group, a TIMO, acquired it. They said, well, let's make our vision, put it on paper, and meet with the landowner. And I went with them to meet with the landowner manager. And the landowner manager said, well, if you can raise some money, I'd be willing to talk with you about easement and fee. This is, I have to always look at my notes here, 311,000 acres of easement that was finally enacted, and they acquired 27,000 acres of fee to manage themselves. They formed their own land trust. And that's the courage to agree to raising $60 million when Probably most of them raised about, their income was maybe 60,000 a year. I mean, I will say that I was very moved by that, and they did it, and it's real and it's permanent. And then the Katahdin conservation easement and the Debskineggs, I would take another hour to describe what happened there, but if you can read at least about this orange area here, this is 200,000 acre easement and 41,000 acre fee acquisition with an ecological reserve easement on top of it. And to me, the Debskineggs are the wildest place in Maine. And the wildest place in Maine. They'd actually not been heavily harvested by Great Northern that had owned them originally. Great Northern even had put them on a map of their 2 million acres of ownership as a remote backcountry area. And here we have a chain of lakes, the Debskinegg Lakes, going from 8th to 7th to 6th to 5th to 4th to 2nd to 1st, and then the Debskinegg Deadwater, flowing down elevation, wild, there's snow cave there, there's old growth, and it's permanently conserved, and it's in a very wild place just south of Baxter State Park, and it's now embedded. If you can sort of get a sense here, look at all of the conserved land around it now. It's embedded in a conserved landscape of intact forest land. So I think the West Branch, oh no, I forgot about the West Branch. The West Branch is blue here. And this is also an amazing story. and it was a hard story. This project came into public view when a lot of people were starting to scrutinize, are easements good? Can we trust them? Are they going to be strong enough? Are they really going to protect the land? And so it got caught up in a lot of debate and a lot of scrutiny, and it was hard for the landowner, it was hard for the advocates and negotiators, yet it was important, and it was important to have that discussion. And ultimately here, we have 282,000 acre easement and a 42,000 acre acquisition by the state to protect this area here. And so each of these stories, I'm hardly doing any justice to any of them, but hopefully you'll get a little flavor of the fact that each has its own challenge, its own personality, its own cast of characters. Each one almost was lost. In my view, I thought West Branch was going down the tubes for a while. Obviously, the TNC St. John, they thought they'd lost it early on. The Down East Lakes, it took them years to raise that money. All of it hard work, yes.
Where did a lot of this money come from? You talk about people who have a $60,000 income creating somehow together $60 million that they needed to buy these lands. Where did this come from? Corporations, government institutions, individuals?
So each project had its own budget, its own fundraising plan. A great deal of money came from some federal programs called the Forest Legacy Program. Forest Legacy is run by the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and comes out of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This is a lot of acronyms and names, but it's been a strong, forceful program for forest conservation easements and acquisition. However, they have to be held or owned by the state. So it worked for the West Branch project for the state land. It worked for some of the projects, not all. There's also a state program called the Land for Maine Future program that Maine voters have supported money through bonds to supply over the years. Occasionally, the legislature appropriates money. That was used to match some of this. But by far and large, it was philanthropy. Foundations, people. The Pingree project, I think it was a kind of a cheap easement in the sense that it was, I think, $37.10 an acre or something. if you divided the amount of acreage by the cost of buying it. And so they were suggesting people buy a couple acres of easement, and I did. So it was a mix of things, and each one kind of figured it out, and it was a time when there was national attention because of the Northern Forest Land Study, because it was in New York Times, there was, some articles that half the state of Maine is for sale. I mean, so it was galvanizing a lot of attention and a philanthropy and excitement. So yes.
I haven't heard, maybe I have wax blown up, but I haven't heard you talk about Katahdin Woods and Water in 2016 and how, because that story in and of itself is fascinating to me, the becoming a monument versus park, et cetera. How does that fold in to your process? And I should have opened with thank you for everything, because this is, I think all of your work is extraordinary, and we all are so grateful for your passion and your vision. But I'd just like to hear what you have to say about KWW.
Sure, thank you. And again, this really is more a book from 1990 to 2010. I have it going to 2015 because of the appeal. There was an appeal in courts of the Plum Creek, so that wasn't settled till then. But the Katahdin Woods and Water project is one I couldn't write about because I don't know enough about it. And it really came, it was a group, it was a massively wonderful project. And bits and pieces of it did start during this time. And I'll mention that when I talked about visions way back, half an hour ago, there were some very inspiring visions of strong federal or state ownership across the region. And one of them was by a group called Restore the North Woods. And they were proposing a national park for 3.2 million acres. And that would have been kind of here. And that was a vision that they really pushed, and they may still be pushing. The local staff person, Jim St. Pierre, met with Roxanne Quimby during that time. And early on, I think she might have been somewhat interested and supportive of that. At some point, they sort of parted ways, I don't think acrimoniously, but she then sort of started thinking about, what could she do and how would she go about doing that? I will say that I was working as Deputy Commissioner of Maine's Department of Conservation when she started really looking at the land that she ended up acquiring. And she acquired over time the land here east of Baxter State Park and very generously gave that to the United States. And it is now a national monument. Because I was working for the state at the time and then Forest Society, I personally I don't feel like I could write that story because I don't know it well enough. So I ended the book prior to that. But I think it is a book that should be written. And there are a lot of influences on her that I think guided her along the way, and her son, Lucas St. Clair, and the bravery really of that effort is really amazing. So thank you for bringing that up. And there are other projects that sort of have come subsequent to these 6 big ones that are so impressive. And this isn't meant to say that these are the only ones that are important, but these really kind of grew out of that cataclysmic sale of paper company lands and the aura, the sense of opportunity that arose from that. Yes.
I just have a quick comment and a question. The quick comment is that you haven't mentioned the fact that you've really got spectacular poems that you've written in between the chapters. It's a book of poetry too. The question, because we're now in whatever year we're in, 2025, you've been involved in this, what's currently the biggest land conservation project currently being worked on in the Northeast. This audience might be interested to know what's happening right now with that project.
Yes, so thank you, Ben. Ben's my husband, who helps me fill in the blanks here. So I did want to end with sort of a pep talk here. There is work continuing still. I will say that Maine was in waters. Is it about 70,000 acres? I think it's around that size. It's a national monument and it deserves our support. But there are other major initiatives underway that have continued, since 2010 or so, up and down the coast and throughout really the state. But I can't say that things are going to stay the way they are now. I think if you look at what happens to special places, if you don't take action, more often than not, things happen and we lose them. And, it's private property. Much of this is still private property, and much of it's still owned by only 8 or 10 entities. Only 8 or 10 entities still own the land in the North Woods. And I think it's pretty stable now, but in my job with the Forest Society of Maine, we were constantly talking to these 8 or 10 to say, if you ever think of selling, would you give us a call? Would you be willing to work with us or work with a group of us or the state or someone? Once something unbelievable happens, like it did, you just never know when the shoe might drop again. And I think with forest, the forest industry it's in a tough place right now. I was at a meeting today, and the markets are really hard for hardwood right now. Lumber mills are having a hard time getting machinery because of tariffs. I'm not going to talk about politics, but just the reality of this economy is very hard. And will those landowners that aren't able to sell their wood, if they're not markets for them, will they decide to sell? And I think we need to keep trying to hold on to our Amazon. This is our Amazon. We hear about the Amazon. This is globally significant here. And finding ways to hold on to the vast undeveloped land. And so Ben mentioned a project that I worked on a bit before I retired, just retired, with the Nature Conservancy Maine chapter, Forest Society of Maine, where I work, the Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust, and the Northeast Wilderness Trust. And it's called the McGalloway Project. And I encourage you, if you are interested in learning about a real life, real-time project that's really big, this is it. It's about 70,000 acres, and it's right over here. And it connects conserved land here with conserved land here. And that fills in a hole of unconserved land with easement and fee, ecological reserve, and again, assures the access on the easement. I like to fly fish, and this is something that was near and dear to my heart. This is sort of the most important cold water refugia for brook trout in Maine remaining. And even in the easement, the streams have very strong buffers where there can't be harvesting, so that the water can stay cool and there won't be siltation. There's also a 12,000 acre wilderness area, I call it ecological reserve, that the Northeast Wilderness Trust is buying in the northern part. And Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust is buying a sizable parcel, 5,000 acres along the Little McGalloway. And Forest Society of Maine will hold on to a 62,000 acre easement with those stream protections. So this is expensive, and I encourage you to learn about this. So if you were to look up McGalloway.com, I think www.mcgalloway.com, you could learn about it. And this is a real life example. And there are others. So it's not stopping. And so Ben mentioned that I do write poems, and I don't think of myself as a poet, but let's see, I could finish with my one poem. How's that? And this is sort of like a pep talk. The ascent. So think of us ascending the challenge before us. Hanging in the mist, ragged, the mountain is tired, crumbling. Falls light glances against its talus. Hues of granite buckle and fold in ancient forms. My mind wanders along the spine of this upthrust massif. The thin, panicked voice of a displaced crow scatters in the glacial cirques, and I begin the climb. So it's just a little, in between each chapter, I put a poem to try to give the reader a rest and to maybe ponder and reflect on their relationship to something special. And I do want to emphasize, I wrote these stories, but there were so many people that helped do this. There were politicians that actually put their necks out and did amazing things to help us get money. There were these individuals in the communities. There were advocacy groups. There were landowners who were so brave to try. They would say, okay, I'll wait 3 years before we get paid, because the option agreements for some of these were 3 years long. The bravery is everywhere because I think people realize how special this place is and want to put their shoulder to holding on to it. So that's all. I hope that was informative. Yes.
I think in this time, since the work that you have presented, the land trusts have surged, I think, too, and it would be really interesting to know, and I think that we probably can, how much more land has been conserved, put in easements by the many land trusts that I think have emerged during this time too, saying, in that panic of, we've got to do something. I really appreciate your perspective and your full transparency that you're not an academic. That was actually quite refreshing. You're obviously a very hard, diligent leader in this field, and I really appreciate your passion and where you're coming from and making this really Maine stories. I think that's going to be really accessible for a lot of people in this story. So thank you.
Let me answer your question though, because Maine is now tracking how much land is conserved.
Yeah.
And we're at 23% now. And Maine has set a goal of 30% by 2030 because of the climate sequestration benefits and the many benefits that flow from it. But that other 4% was, since this time, is all the hard work of all the land trusts and some state acquisition.
You talked about hydropower within those areas. I know, are there a lot of dams? Because I think the state of Maine is trying to remove many of the dams now.
There are a number of dams that have been removed, Edwards Dam, for example, and others have been reconfigured to allow genuine fish passage. There are still dams operated by Brascan, a Canadian company, up more in the northern part of the state. But I'm afraid I don't have all the numbers at my fingertips. But it's worth looking at. Yeah. Yes.
How do you get these stories told? You need to seem to be out there. Before it becomes a crisis, We're still on dialogue. I'm sure that there's a time in place now. To share this information, what are the challenges of getting news organizations or, I don't know.
I appreciate that, and I think a lot of groups are trying to. I think it's just hard work, and I should say I'm not accepting any proceeds from this book. All of the proceeds are going to groups doing conservation in the North Wabanaki Land Return Fund. But I'm doing, I mean, all the groups, leaders, boards, you know, people in different communities are trying to pay attention. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Bravo.
Feel free to go, but I'm happy to stay as long as people have.
Central Maine.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, and I should say, there's Jane, my friend Jane Barron is here. And part of the book recognizes the role of women in the outdoor economy. And Jane is a guide and is an expert professional paddler. And all of that came of age during this time.
Great.
Thank you.